Hi everyone, good day and welcome to this episode of the PoshPod. With me is Laxmi Char, co-founder Parity Consulting. I am Bishen Jeswant, partner in the employment law practice at Cyril Amachan Magaldas. Okay, so what are we discussing today? On this episode, we're discussing what we imagine is an issue that multiple organizations are grappling with, multiple HR teams, ICs are grappling with, as to what can be the role of the HR in an investigation process, right? So there are three parts to this. We'll discuss. The first part will be the role of the HR in the complaint receiving process, and two, the role of the HR in the investigation process, and three, in relation to deliberating, assessing the findings and implementing those recommendations, right? Those are the three broad buckets. So let's discuss the first part, getting right into it. Receiving a complaint, right? In my experience of having seen multiple POSH policies over the years, a number of companies have policies which indicate that complaints are to be filed with the HR. And in some cases, that complaints may initially be raised with your manager and resolved with the manager if it is minor, right? So we've seen multiple forms of complaint receiving, but the reality is the complaint must be made only to the IC, right? The IC receives the complaint, makes an assessment of jurisdiction, and then takes the process further in the manner set out under the POSH Act. So this, and not doing that, in fact, having a policy which says that the HR must receive the complaint takes away from the confidentiality obligations under the IC, under the POSH Act, right? Because there is an obligation to ensure that the names of parties, the proceedings are confidential. And as soon as HR becomes aware of this, in this case, even before the IC does, there is potentially a breach of those confidentiality obligations. So, one, what should your policy say? And two, regardless of what your policy says, employees are probably going to do what they want in terms of raising complaints with people they feel comfortable with, right? If an employee feels trust that she trusts her manager, she's likely going to go to him in the first place anyway, regardless of what your policy says, because she's never seen the face of those IC members and doesn't know who they are, right? So one, what should the policy say? I think it's very clear. The policy must only talk about complaints being made to the IC, right? The policy should not allow for the complaints to be made elsewhere. But there should be sensitization to other members of the organization as to what they should do if they receive a complaint or become aware of an incident of sexual harassment, because that is going to happen regardless of what you write in your policy, right? So, and the solution there is maybe to sensitize the members, senior management or senior members of the team, maybe put a threshold and say everybody above management attend training sessions to understand what needs to be done, right? There's also a possibility here of saying that anyone who becomes aware of sexual harassment happening in the organization or receives an informal complaint should report that to the IC. And the IC can then take a call on what needs to be done, which will most likely, which should ideally be to go to the woman, the victim, right? The supposed victim, and ask her, we've heard this happened. Did it happen? Do you want to file a complaint? Make it very clear there's no pressure to file a complaint. Let her know this is only an option. Give her access to all the data that is in the organization in terms of policies, so that she knows, becomes aware of her rights, and she takes an independent call on whether she wants to file a complaint with no pressure. But the IC to go to her and let her know this is an option that she has. This way, every issue of sexual harassment goes all the way up to the IC and is dealt with, as opposed to it being stopped at manager level or confidant level. I'll pause there and throw to Laxmi. I'm sure she has thoughts on this, having seen this happen a few times.
Yes, unfortunately, yes, we have seen this happen more than just a few times. And it's very interesting to kind of navigate how different organizations are, attempting to mitigate this situation. Because on the one hand, you are absolutely right, Bishen, from an aggrieved woman's perspective, trust and confidence really drive her decision making. And we can look at it in a couple of ways, right? Who do I trust enough to be able to go and tell that person what is happening to me? Because there is the social stigma attached at the end of the day that maybe I'm doing something wrong, right? Maybe I'm dressing wrong or whatever. So I need to trust this person enough. And typically we find that human psychology being what it is, trust is relative to, relationship. It's relative to time. So when I've spent most of my time interacting with my manager, it's pretty likely that I would trust this manager to kind of guide me in what I should do, or sometimes even just be a ear, to listen to what I'm going through. The second part of it, of course, and you talked about, again, the policy is very clear. We also have organizations who are treating this as a great opportunity to demonstrate the psychological safety of their workplace culture, where they teach any kind of people manager that, look, if somebody walks up to you and says, I have a problem, how do you deal with it? Specifically when it's related to sexual harassment, obviously you have to be respectful to this person. You don't poo-poo it, nor do you want to magnify it. And then guide that person to the resources that she needs, because it is the Posh Act and therefore it is an aggrieved woman, that she needs to choose to make her own decision. Interestingly, the point that you raised about, hey, if the IC comes to know, let's say that, Anamika has gone to her manager and said, this is what is happening to me, manager, let's IC know. We found pros and cons to the IC reaching out to Anamika. Sometimes it really is the power of the position and the power of the personality of the IC member, which can be seen as kind of, nudging this woman in a direction that she may not yet be ready to. So it's very important that ICs, and the Act talks about training the ICs. It talks about gender sensitization. It talks about, all these broader things. And I think this is a great example where managers, HR folk, and IC members need to understand how language impacts the receiver, right? And at the end of the day, as an adult woman, it's her choice, and you've got to respect her choice. So it is very much a gray area, I think, in the real world right now.
Yeah, fair, Laxmi. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so the IC needs to be sensitive about how they reach out to a woman to make sure that she genuinely feels like she has an option to either file or not to file. Fair. Okay, so let's move on to the next part of the discussion. So it's clear the policy must not say that complaints are to be filed to HR or anybody else. The complaints must come to the IC. Now the complaint has come to the IC. The investigation has started. Now again, we've seen cases where the involvement of HR during the investigation process is possibly in violation of what the Posh Act mandates. For example, I have seen a number of cases where the HR has been sitting in on IC hearings. And I'm talking here about HR members who are not already on the internal committee itself. Of course, then it's fine for HR to be in the room. But I'm talking about non-IC HR members also being in the room because they almost feel like they have an involvement in the process since they were the stakeholders who initiated the process. The complaint was received by them possibly, right? And so they sit in on hearings. Sometimes in discussions, I've heard members of HR tell me that, let us know if what we're doing is right here, if the report looks in good shape, and we'll make sure that the language in the report is appropriate, and I'll make sure the IC does it right. But the HR doesn't have a role here to advise the IC, right? The HR is not in an advisory role vis-a-vis the IC. Neither is the HR superior to the IC in that they are coordinating like in a manager role either, right? It's not. The IC is an independent body which has the powers of a civil court under the Posh Act, to call upon evidence, to call upon witnesses and all of that. So a non-IC HR member should not have any role to play in the investigation process. And so then what is the role of the HR member? I would say it is during the investigation process only to assist the IC to make sure that, say, all records and documentation that they need is available to them, to possibly coordinate with other members of the organization so that they're able to come and present themselves as witnesses and things like that. It's very much an administrative role, because if the HR over involves itself in the investigation process, there is a possibility of the, confidentiality obligations under the Posh Act being breached, and we should be very careful to make sure that doesn't happen, because after this long IC process is run, it would be very sad if it was held to be in breach of the Posh Act and therefore invalid.
You raise again, a very good point, and the reality is that, right, where we've got HR who, and with the best of intentions, right? They genuinely believe that there is value that they are adding, that in terms of advising, guiding, or influencing the IC's thinking, the IC's deliberations around this, and sometimes even the IC's recommendations. As you said, from a best practice perspective, it's good to have somebody from HR in the room as part of the IC because it covers all of this thing. If there is value, and there always is, value in having an HR voice on the IC, then having a member of the HR department as a member of the IC makes sense. Thinking that the IC will be able to bring an HR person into the room when I need them, that is, a little kind of questionable, right? And the HR also feeling that they have a seat at the table that they can take whenever they feel like it. That's not true because, as you said, the confidentiality of the IC is really paramount. We've seen definitely the IC being, the IC and the HR working together in terms of the admin, the coordination, the logistics and stuff. And if there is no HR person on the IC, then the recommendations from the IC, the final report, to be sent as far as the act is concerned to the employer, which we translate to senior management. And the HR's role over there is to receive the guidance from the senior management and implement whatever those recommendations are, right? It's interesting to see how different organizations kind of co-opt this element into their policies. When you're doing your auditing or diligence, do you see any differences in this space?
Yeah, so sometimes what happens, Laxmi, is the process is set out such that the recommendations go straight from the IC to the HR for implementation, right? So, for example, if termination is the recommended, outcome by the IC, then sometimes that just goes straight to HR for implementation of the termination. But that's not the correct process to follow because the requirement is for the IC to send this to the employer, right? And the employer to implement. The HR is not the employer because the HR is not responsible for taking the hiring and firing decision. The HR would assist with hiring and firing, but the decision-making stakeholder there is the employer, which could be senior management or the board, as the case may be. So the recommendations must go to the senior management or the board who take, let's say in this case, a firing decision, and they may involve the IC in implementing that firing decision. So the order in which it happens is relevant, and also that the HR should not have a role in influencing what that recommendation is. There may be cases where the IC, because they don't have a complete picture of the workings of the organization, are not in a position to determine what is the most suitable recommendation that is operationally feasible. In those cases, they may, ask the HR to come and, present before them and hear the HR possibly as part of the IC proceedings itself to understand what is the good recommendation. And having heard the advice of the HR on that, the IC will decide finally what their recommendation is, right? To which is then to be passed on to employer, and the employer will implement if they deem fit with the HR's assistance. So that's the sequence of events. That's the order in which it should go so that no party is considered to be overstepping its bounds.
Yeah. And I think that's really kind of reassuring for the IC, for senior management, and for the HR themselves, right? Because the more we understand what our jurisdiction is and what is the role that we are playing, the better and more competent we get in playing those roles. So, coming to the end of yet another very, very interesting conversation, Bishen. I love when we agree to disagree and just having this duality of views. I hope that our viewers and listeners find it useful as well. So, folks, let us know. What do you think? How can we make this even more meaningful to you? Thank you so much for your attention today.
Thanks, Laxmi. Great conversation. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Bye.